All right, everybody, back in with another reading hour. Keep my noise canceling going. Get the Instagram started up. All right, there we go. All right, so now we can pick back up on the Gladio book with chapter 13, a section called The Shell Game. He was a perfectly normal person, without vices. He lived for power. He was frighteningly introverted. He never looked you in the eye when he spoke. It used to drive me mad. I wanted to hit him over the head with a hammer. And this is Roberto Razzone talking about Roberto Calvi, quoted in Philip Willen's The Vatican at War, 2003. It began as a means of providing funding to Operation Gladio and its strategy of tension, along with to Operation Condor and its support of right-wing regimes in South and Central America. Pablo Escobar and other leading drug lords were encouraged, often by priests and bishops and by Roberto Calvi, to deposit their earnings in 8 firms that had been set up by the Vatican as money laundries. 6 of these firms, Astolfini S.A., United Trading Corporation, Erin S.A., E-R-I-N, Bellatrix S.A., Belrose S.A., and Starfield S.A., were in Panama. A 7th, Manic S.A., yeah, Manic, that's wild, in Luxembourg, and the 8th, Nord Europe establishment in Liechtenstein. By 1978, when John Paul II ascended to the papal throne, the money coming into these firms from the Medellin cartel alone was enormous, since Escobar, at the height of his power, was smuggling 15 tons of cocaine into the United States every day. 15 tons a day. That's insane. So yeah, at the height of his power, I guess that's how much Pablo Escobar was trafficking. That's quite a large amount. Explains the massive amounts of money he was dealing with. The 8 laundries were simply storefronts, managed by secretaries and street thugs. The money they received was wired or transported by courier, often a cleric, to the central headquarters of Banco Ambrosiano in Milan. From Milan, the money was rerouted to the IOR, which charged a processing fee of 15 to 20%. From Vatican City, the funds were transferred to numbered bank accounts at Banca del Gottardo or Union Bank of Switzerland. With the money flowing between tax-sheltered banks, the Guardia di Finanza, Italy's financial police, and other bank auditing agencies were hard-pressed to obtain the names of the depositors, let alone evidence of criminal malfeasance. Yeah, so that's in 2 paragraphs. That's a description of all the people involved in the shell game, and then how it actually worked, very specifically. And you got to understand, like, if you watch any of the shows or movies that depict this, it's like you can run an entire bank out of like hotel rooms, and I think this has even been discussed in this book. You have adjoining rooms, and one room acts as the, I guess, like the foyer, like the receiving area, the ante room, and you have your thugs and your goons to make sure that anybody is like patted down, nobody's coming in with weapons, nobody's coming in to assassinate you or rob you. And then if they are passed on to the next room, they get to do business. They get to see the important people. They get to deal with the money. So it's like once you just remove the law, you can do really heavy business just about anywhere. The location doesn't really matter so much. So the 8 laundries, I read that they were simply storefronts. This next section here is Air Scranton. The CIA was an active participant in the arrangement since the agency was deeply involved with Escobar and the drug cartels. As soon as the laundries were created, the CIA set up Air America North America, a fleet of Seneca cargo planes that operated out of the Wilkes-Barre Scranton Airport in Avoca, Pennsylvania. The planes made regular 3,000-mile runs to Colombia to pick up the bundles of cocaine that were distributed to dealers throughout the East Coast. Frederick Rick Loiches, the head of the outfit, and his fellow pilots made up to $1.5 million per run. Loiches, by his own admission, was a CIA operative, and the funds were used to sponsor black operations in South and Central America. A substantial amount of this cash was funneled into the IOR's offshore shells. Okay, so you have shell companies, you have shell banks, you have CIA front banks and that handle entire swaths of money for drug cartels to be funneled off to these quite literal Nazis, paramilitaries, guerrilla operatives who are doing anti-communist operations. Next section here is limitless loans. In addition to the cash from the cartels, money poured into the 8 shell companies in the form of loans from Banco Ambrosiano in Milan. The loans were easy to obtain. Roberto Calvi, who remained Ambrosiano's CEO, convinced the bank's directors that the offshore firms were concerns of the Vatican for the exportation of, quote, parochial goods. Hard to imagine what these parochial goods might be if you actually pressed them on this, but whatever. Of all the directors of all the banks in the world, the directors of Banco Ambrosiano were the least likely to question the integrity of the undertakings of the Holy Mother Church. The bank had been established in 1896 by Giuseppe Tovini to provide financial service to the Roman Catholic institutions and families. Named after St. Ambrose, the firm's expressly Catholic character was protected by a statute that required shareholders and directors to submit a baptismal certificate and statement of good conduct from their parish priest before they could vote. So you quite literally have to get like community backing. Like, I can't tell you how many times I'm reading things like this where they're either describing like black operations, far right operations, or just simply like successful state infrastructure, like structures of like a parliamentary governance or whatever. And so much of it is just in a roundabout way doing community. Like they just have structured and written down ways of like vetting people, of checking on their actual community. And these are like successful organizations that are able to wield power, as opposed to ones that like can't vet people, can't tell who is who, what their motives may be, don't understand the history of people that are coming into it, and are horizontalist in nature and just expect something to get done against these very highly organized and structured groups. This is another instance of that for sure. Ambrosiano's independence from secular interest was protected by a statute that barred any individual from obtaining more than 5% of its shares. The bank's purpose was to serve, quote, moral organizations, pious works, and religious bodies set up for charitable aims. Any objection to that the directors might have to the strange new offshore companies were offset by the fact that the loans were sent not to Liechtenstein or Luxembourg, but directly to the Vatican Bank. Okay, so they might be objecting to the shadiness in some way, but they're making too much money and they're cutting out the middleman. So they're not going to object very long. This next section here is the first purpose. Almost overnight, the 8 phony firms became multi-million-dollar businesses that had been established without capital expenditure. It was a mind-boggling accomplishment. The Ponzi scam served a threefold purpose. The first was to provide a new source of arms revenue for, quote, gladiators involved in the strategy of tension and right-wing regimes, even the regimes at war with America's closest allies. I also forgot about that. I forgot that the actual operatives themselves were called gladiators, and that's why it's part of Operation Gladio. Bellatrix, for example, used $200 million of its assets to purchase French-made Exocet AM-39 missiles for Argentina's military junta in its struggle with England over the Falkland Islands. Other offshore companies engaged in obtaining Libyan arms supplies for the Argentine troops and for Nicaragua's Anastasio Somoza Debayle, whose regime was threatened by left-wing Sandinista National Liberation Front. So yeah, companies are quite literally getting arms supplies for Libya, from Libya, to arm the Argentine troops, and also Nicaragua's dictatorship against the Sandinistas. But it's like that would be in the U.S.'s interest. Like the U.S. never wanted the Sandinistas to win. I guess it's just a happenstance that it worked in their favor at that time. I forgot to put up the caption here. If anyone wants some links to all these documents, that is again youtube.com/@tcotepod/streams. And that's the link to all these past reading hours if you want to check them out. And in the description is the link to all the stuff that I'm reading if you want to follow along. What's going on, Shibbles? Good morning. Sorry, I just got to block some bots. All right, so back to the Gladio book here. Since the Vatican owned the companies, Holy Mother... Oh, wait, did I skip a paragraph? No, I didn't. Okay. Since the Vatican owned the companies, Holy Mother Church was becoming a principal source of murder and violence throughout Italy and Latin America. Licio Gelli was a pivotal figure in the plan. along with fellow P2 members Umberto Ortolani, who had received the title Gentleman of His Holiness from Pope Paul VI, and Bruno Tasson Din, the managing director of the huge Rizzoli publishing firm. Jelly had created many of the offshore companies, or corporations, including Bellatrix. He was also charged with overseeing the distribution of arms in Italy and South America through P2, which had established lodges in Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay. Jelly was the perfect man for the job. He retained dual citizenship in Italy and Argentina and was well known and respected by the leading Latino strongmen, including Argentina's Jorge Videla, Chile's Agustino Pinochet, and Bolivia's Hugo Banzer Suarez, and Paraguay's General Alfredo Stroessner. Stroessner sounds like a German name. I wonder if that has anything to do with it. The next section here is the second purpose. The second purpose of the scam was for the Vatican Bank to obtain financial control of the wealthy Milan Bank. The shell companies used a portion of the loans to purchase Ambrosiano stock. Since the bank's charter prohibited any institution or person gaining more than 5% of the shares, the stock was purchased by a multitude of phony corporations that were spin-offs of the 8 phony firms. The United Trading Corporation, for example, spawned a host of nominal subsidiaries, including Ulricor, La Fidele, FinProgram, Ordeo, Lantana, Casadia, Marbella, Imparfin, and Teclefin. By 1982, Ulricor ranked as the 8th largest shareholder of Ambrosiano stock with 1.2%. To conceal the fraud, Calvi opened Ambrosiano Group Banco Comercial in Managua. Its official function was, quote, conducting international commercial transactions. But its real function was to serve as a repository beyond the purview of the Guardia di Finanza, where all evidence concerning the fraudulent and criminal devices used to acquire majority interest in the Milan parent bank could be concealed. Okay, so that's basically describing how you open up enough shell companies that even the people who are, like, literally their job is to do the due diligence, like to look into these financial entities, like look into all the paperwork of who owns what to make sure it's not just one big circle of people buying something from themselves. They were able to disguise it well enough that either the entire Italian financial police, such as they exist, were not able to find it, or they were purposely prevented from finding it, or were bribed enough that they overlooked it. But it seems like they're just burying it deep in shell companies. Like imagine like just doing the adult version of like hiding something by putting it in enough folders that nobody can find it. Silly. For this convenience, of course, there was a price to be paid. Calvi traveled with Jelly to Nicaragua and dropped several million into Somoza's pocket. The dictator was so pleased that he not only pronounced his blessing upon the new branch, but also granted Calvi a Nicaraguan diplomatic passport, which he retained for the rest of his life. To increase the value of the shares, Calvi announced huge stock dividends and rights offerings, along with optimistic pronouncements about the future of Banco Ambrosiano and its new Latin branches. The shares began to split and split again. The shells used their increased stock holdings to borrow more money, with which they purchased more stock in the name of more and more new spin-off firms. They never paid interest on their borrowings. They simply added the accrued interest to their loan balances and backed their obligation for collateral with more of their bank stock. It worked like a charm. By the start of 1981, the Vatican had succeeded in gaining ownership of 16% of Ambrosiano's shares. Okay, once again, just describing in pretty easy detail, like how you just create a bunch of money out of nowhere. If you don't pay any interest, if you're never taxed, if you just keep using the money that you've accrued as the credit to borrow more money and you don't pay any interest on any of that, it's pretty cool. You could just make money out of nowhere. I love that, like, right-wingers and capitalist libertarians, like, these are their genius ideas to create wealth, is just fucking make it up. And they're always so pissed when sticklers like the government or the communists tell them they shouldn't be able to do that and immiserate millions of people while they do it. The next section here is the Pope's purpose. The third purpose of the scam was to provide funding for solidarity in Poland. As soon as he was crowned with the tiara, John Paul II met in private with Calvi to demand that an ample share of the money from the Ponzi scheme be channeled to Lech Wałęsa, who had been, quote, sent by God, by Providence. Such payments met with the approval of Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor, and General Vernon Walters, the U.S. ambassador at large. By 1981, over $100 million in funds from the drug cartels and the illegal bank loans flowed into the coffers of the struggling Polish labor movement, making the new pope a great hero to his native country. Few, including Walesa, opted to look the gift horse in the mouth to discern that the true source of the manna from heaven was the drug trade. Yeah, why would you look into it too much? Early in 1982, Calvi discussed the Pope's involvement in laundering money for solidarity with Flavio Carboni, an emissary to Ambrosiano from the CIA. This dude's name is Flavio Carboni. With a name like that, why would he not be a CIA agent? Probably got bullied his whole life. In one of their secretly taped conversations, Calvi can be heard saying, Marcinkus must watch out for Casaroli. Casaroli is also funny. Who is head of the group that opposes him. If Casaroli should meet one of those financiers in New York who are working with Marcinkus, sending money to Solidarity, the Vatican would collapse. Or even if Casaroli should find one of those papers that I know of, goodbye Marcinkus, goodbye Woj Taita, goodbye Solidarity. The last operation would be enough, the one for $20 million. I've also told Prime Minister Andreotti, but it's not clear which side he is on. If things in Italy go a certain way, the Vatican will have to rent a building in Washington behind the Pentagon. A far cry from St. Peter's. Hilarious. So we obviously know from history that things did not go the wrong way for the Vatican, apparently, because they are still one of the wealthiest organizations in human history. And it's not like they're paying taxes on it. Primary employment is the next section here. In addition to the shell game, Calvi remained Sindona's successor as the principal banker for the heroin trade. Insight into Calvi's position as the mob's consigliere, or advisor, was provided on November 4th, 1996, when Francesco Marino Manoia, the leading pentito, or collaborator working with the authorities, from the Sicilian Mafia, testified in the Andreotti trial. He told the court that Calvi became the key figure in laundering heroin revenue for the American Mafia after the arrest warrant for Sindona had been issued by the Italian financial police in 1976. The heroin, according to Manoia, continued to be sent to the Gambino family of Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Man, that's like, I've been there so many times. I know Cherry Hill very well. It's very funny. The Gambinos deposited large sums of their earnings in the banks controlled by Calvi for cleansing by the IOR. Eventually, the money was used by the American mob to purchase hotels, land, and financial companies in Florida and the island of Aruba. Wow, the mob just owned the island of Aruba. Did not know that. Gelli, Manoia said, remained the principal figure for the Sicilian Mafia. This fact, he said, was evidenced by the case of Stefano Bontade, who regularly oversaw the refinement of 1,000 kilograms of heroin that flowed into his laboratory from the Balkan route. Bontade's shares of the profits for each shipment was $150 million. This money, according to Manoia, was delivered to Gelli, who used a string of Sicilian banks and Banco Ambrosiano to funnel the cash to the central laundry, that is, the Vatican. The day after Manoia spilled his guts, his mother, sister, aunt, and two uncles were murdered within their homes in Bagheria, Sicily. Manoia's testimony concerning Calvi was confirmed by other mafia informants, including Antonio Gioffri, who had enjoyed a close relationship with Sicilian Capo di Tutti Capi, boss of all bosses, Pippo Caldi. I think that's I thought it was Pippo Caldi from before. Either way, I'll read this next section here, and then I'll wrap up this book for the day. This section is Stibum Sidebar. Thanks to the new heroin network, all of the profits of Stibum International were recycled through Banco Ambrosiano. Calvi also handled all of the foreign currency exchanges for the company. Stibum began to receive strange guests, including Thomas Angioletti, an agent with the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. It also entered into major business transactions with a mysterious American named Garth Reynolds, who maintained an office in London. Reynolds gained access to an incredible array of weapons that he supplied to Stibum, including Cobra helicopters fully loaded with rockets, anti-tank guns, incendiary rockets, and RPG-7 rocket launchers. He was arrested in Los Angeles in 1980 and, like a true spook, disappeared forever from the United States criminal justice system. What a feat. Isn't that so cool that, like, people who have access to some of the highest level weapons can just disappear from the records of the U.S. justice system like that? Pretty weird how that can just happen. All right, so I'm going to bookmark this one here for the day. And now we will switch over to Western Marxism. See if anything's going on in the chat. Shubal says, it's like the principles of capitalism are literally made up. Oh, yeah, referring to like the Ponzi scheme. Yeah, you just like make it all up. Just create wealth out of nowhere. Marx never predicted this. Oh, wait, he did. He talked about fictitious capital. All right, so picking up in the Western Marxism book, this is not to underestimate the novelty of these two authors. So let's see. I could go back a little bit and see which exact two authors we're talking about. Got to be Foucault and Agamben, or it's possibly Levinus. So anyway, this is not to underestimate the novelty of these two authors. The theory of totalitarianism and biopolitics put the Third Reich and the Soviet Union on the same plane, but Marx, if not spared, had not been directly implicated. Now, instead, as a starting point of the parabola that resulted in the Third Reich, which was trying to build a colonial and slave empire in Eastern Europe and reaffirming the supremacy of the white and Aryan race, we are presented with a philosopher who not only denounced the colonialist system in its entirety, but also denounced black slavery with fiery words and expressed his indignation over the sympathies certain important sectors of the liberal British world had for the secessionist and slavery-based Confederacy. On the other side, we find the liberal world, which for centuries had been amply involved in the world colonialist slavery system, and with the regime of white supremacy in the U.S. South, which was still in power in the mid-20th century, and which Nazi leaders admired, now immersed in a cleansing bath. It is a total misunderstanding of real history, a history that mostly took place under the banner of an exalted pathos of Europe and of the West, and to which Nazism was anything but foreign. Okay, so yeah, that's another great paragraph just explaining what we on the anti-imperialist left have all come to understand in recent years, which is that the West is not opposed to fascism in any way whatsoever. It may have professed to do so in the period after World War II because it was politically convenient and performatively convenient to do so, like rhetorically convenient. But only did so ever from a place of like equating communism, which again was the thing that actually defeated fascism. By equating communism and fascism, that was the place that the West has rhetorically occupied pretty much since the end of World War II, further on into the Cold War, and then since the end of the Soviet Union, the West got to exalt in that. The West was just like really reveling in its own glory, just like, gazing in the mirror, just enjoying its own shit, and pretending it was like the arbiter of freedom and democracy, presenting liberalism as like an alternative to either communism or fascism. But now we are seeing that when pressed, it has always been fascism. And of course, I'm reading this in conjunction with the Gladio book for a reason, so I can show you that this has never not been part of it. It's only been performative. So I guess this is chapter 10 here, Negri and Hart and the Esoteric Celebration of Empire. The esoteric history of racism and biopolitics is an indirect apologia for the liberal West, whose role as a protagonist of the history of colonial expansion and the racism connected to it is hushed up or greatly underestimated. With Negri and Hart, the picture changes. The apologia becomes direct and esoteric, and emphatic. This might seem like a polemical judgment. To refute this impression, engaging in a sort of intellectual experiment, or if one likes a game, may be useful. Let's compare two pieces by authors who compare the United States favorably to Europe. The first celebrates, quote, the American experience, emphasizing, quote, the difference between a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, and the nations of the Old World, which certainly were not conceived in liberty. And now let's see the second. So, a quote here. Was not American democracy, in fact, founded on the democracy of Exodus, on affirmative and non-dialectical values, and on pluralism and freedom? Did not these values, along with the notion of new frontiers, perpetually recreate the expansion of its democratic basis beyond every abstract obstacle of the nation, ethnicity, and religion? When Arendt claimed the American Revolution to be superior to the French because the American was an unlimited search for political freedom, and the French a limited struggle over scarcity and inequality, she not only celebrated an ideal of freedom that Europeans no longer knew, but also reterritorialized it in the United States. Which of these two pieces is more apologetic? It is difficult to say. Both observed the most rigorous silence about the fate of the indigenous peoples and of blacks, the Monroe Doctrine, the subjugation of the Philippines, and the merciless repression and genocidal practices against its independence movement. And even if the scale of the erasures and the apologetic zeal left us with no desire to side with either of them, we can say that the second piece is more inspired and lyrical. It came from the pens of Hart and Negri, while the first was by Leo Strauss, the leading author for U.S. neoconservatives. With little variation, this intellectual experiment and this game can be repeated over and over, and always with the same result. What is the real meaning of the revolt against the government of London by the English colonies in America that resulted in the founding of the United States? We have seen the enthusiasm expressed by two authoritative exponents of Western Marxism. Now let's read the analysis of an American scholar. So another long quote here. The American Revolution was not a social revolution like the French, Russian, Chinese, Mexican, or Cuban revolutions. It was a war of independence. Moreover, it was not a war of independence of natives against alien conquerors, like the struggles of the Indonesians against the Dutch or the Vietnamese, or the Algerians against the French, but instead a war of settlers against the home country. Any recent parallels are in the relation of the Algerian colons to the French Republic or the Southern Rhodesians to the United Kingdom. At least as far as the relations with the colonial peoples and those of colonial origin are concerned, the founding of the United States resembled a more counter-revolution than a revolution. A conservative author, Samuel Huntington, who was at the time a rising and authoritative U.S. historian, recognized this, but it is blasphemy to the authors of Empire. So that's a great point. Like, that's a counter-revolution. If you have a bunch of white colonizers coming in and taking a system that is egalitarian and then disrupting it, subjugating all the people to slavery or genociding them, that is quite literally a counter-revolution. At least the beginning phase. And then, so I guess the American Revolution itself, is that also supposed to be a counter-revolution? Let's see. So yeah, the founding of the United States is definitely a counter-revolution. I wonder what they would consider the, well, I guess that is. Then you're not even talking about the colonial process. I guess it's just taking that in a sum total, like going from the settlers arriving all the way up until the signing of the Constitution. That would be the founding and creation of the United States. That would be the counter-revolutionary part. But let's continue with this comparison. Go back to the book here. In our own times, eminent liberal scholars describe the history of their own country as the history of a, quote, Herrenvolk democracy. That is, a democracy that existed only for the Herrenvolk. Significantly, they have recourse here to the language of Hitler, for the people of the masters, and that, on the other hand, it did not hesitate to enslave blacks and exterminate the native peoples from the face of the earth. Quote, only in the United States was there a stable and direct link between the property in slaves and political power. Only in the United States did slave owners play a central role in founding a nation and creating representative institutions. I don't know if that's something to, I don't think that's a flex, to say that they were the ones who created representative institutions. Or I guess like while holding slaves, that's what they're saying, they're the only ones who did that. So that's what the Greeks did too. That's like the whole thing that I guess either Lenin or Stalin, I can't remember, pointed out. They were like, democracy in the United States is like democracy in ancient Greece. It's why they look up to ancient Greece. It's like literally fake democracy with slaves. Empire instead speaks in reverent tones of the, quote, American democracy that breaks with the transcendent vision of power of the European tradition. And for the authors, referring to Arendt, constitutes the, quote, invention of modern politics itself, or, quote, the establishment of freedom. Scholars who cannot be suspected of anti-Americanism have had no difficulty recognizing that, quote, from the first day of its existence, the United States is an imperial power, and that, quote, there were no more self-confident imperialists than the founding fathers of the North American Republic. Hart and Negri instead always speak about, quote, European colonialism and European imperialism. Quote, imperialism was an extension of the sovereignty of the European nation states beyond their own boundaries. Eventually, nearly all of the world's territories could be parceled out, and the entire world map could be coded in European colors. In conclusion, let's take a central figure in the worldwide rise of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. Among the scholars of history and international politics, it is almost taken for granted to write of, quote, Wilsonian nationalism. This was a president who carried out a record number of military interventions in Latin America in the name of the Monroe Doctrine, intended to side with white supremacy domestically and internationally, and to support the oppression of the colonial peoples and those of colonial origin. But for support, but for Hart and Negri, Wilson becomes a champion of the quote internationalist ideology of peace, far from the quote European style imperialist ideology. Okay, so then how does anybody possibly take Hart and Negri seriously if they're apologetic to Woodrow Wilson? Like, even casual observers of history, even people who don't really know stuff about the presidents or history or American history at all, like, they know that, like, everybody knows Woodrow Wilson was like a terrible racist, like, just an awful dude. Marx's observation about Bakunin comes to mind. For all his anti-statist radicalism, he spared England, quote, the really capitalist state, the one that constituted the, quote, point of the spear of bourgeois society in Europe. Hart and Negri's polemic against the principle of the sovereign state spares the country that grants itself a monstrously expanded sovereignty that authorizes it to intervene in every corner of the world, with or without the authorization of the Security Council of the United Nations. This is the country that, far from building an alternative to European militarism, represents, as Sartre put it, quote, that super-European monstrosity. Yeah, I mean, that's like the best way you could put it. Like, the super-European monstrosity. Like, it grew out of the European Empire, became like this behemoth that was even worse, and it's like still plaguing humanity. All right, so now we're on to part 5. And this is Revival or the Last Gasp of Western Marxism. So section 1 here. Zizek's anti-imperialism. This should be fun because, as we all know, Zizek came out in support of Ukraine after Russia invaded. It's like, I know there's a lot of, it's like the epitome of Western Marxism, and there's so many people who make fun of Zizek and like pretty much have pinned down to a T like what his shtick is, which is like take an imperialist apologetic position, say how it's actually the correct Marxist position, and then spend like pages and pages doing like your dialectical gymnastics to say that that's a legit take. I don't know. So, anyways, Zizek's anti-imperialism. Compared to 1989 and the years immediately following, compared with the period in which the discourse on the unlamented death of Marx had become almost common sense, the ideological framework of our own times today appears quite different. Interest in that great thinker and revolutionary is evident and growing. Authors who, in one way or another, refer to him enjoy considerable prestige and popularity at times. Must we therefore speak of a revival of Western Marxism? Recently, the most illustrious exponent of what he likes to coquettishly self-describe as, quote, libertarian Western Marxism, welcomed 2011 as, quote, the year of dreaming dangerously, of the revival of radical emancipatory politics all around the world. The author, Zizek, hurried to call attention to the disillusion that quickly followed. But let's leave aside the subsequent developments to concentrate on 2011, which was celebrated in such flattering terms. Yes, it was a year in which new protest movements, Occupy Wall Street, the Indignados, etc., seemed to spread like oil stains. But it was also the year in which NATO unleashed a war against Libya that, after having led to tens of thousands of deaths, ended with the horrible lynching of Gaddafi. The neo-colonial character of the aggression was recognized by authoritative organs of the Western press. Nevertheless, Hillary Clinton abandoned herself to exultation so unbalanced, we came, we saw, he died, exclaimed the then Secretary of State, as to arouse moral reservations even in a Fox News reporter, for whom this was disquieting enthusiasm for a war crime. Unfortunately, the infamous neo-colonialist enterprise we are discussing here did not meet any resistance from Western Marxism. In Italy, it was even considered legitimate, at least to a historic figure of this ideological current. Yeah, I mean, people don't talk enough about the early 2010s. I certainly was not as politically aware during that time period, but even I remember having the impression that there were some major things happening. I didn't understand the nature of like Gaddafi being overthrown, the Arab Spring, any of that. I did not understand it was a color revolution back then, or even for significantly, like several years later, or how much that would impact things going forward, how much that would lead to the situation we're seeing now today, Syria being overthrown too. But yeah, people I don't think quite. I mean, I know they don't. I can tell just from the way people are talking about things like Syria, even just 6 months ago. The way they're still talking about Ukraine now, I can tell that people are not understanding the true nature of so many things that happened in the late 2000s, early 2010s, straight on through. Everything is like history since 2016, politically online now, and that's sad because people need to be learning. People certainly forgot Occupy Wall Street and the first iteration of BLM. They've forgotten. They're only remembering like that a police station was burned down. They're not remembering like the millions of like peaceful protests that got absolutely shit done, like absolutely nothing done, except for dozens and dozens of cop cities now being built, and the largest police and military budgets the U.S. has ever had, year after year. Anyway, still in 2011, in Tel Aviv and other Israeli cities, hundreds of thousands of indignados went to the squares to protest high prices and unsustainable rents. They were careful not to question the persistent and accelerated colonization of Palestinian territories. So yeah, very much like the Western left here in America. They will go and protest about declining conditions for themselves. They want more free stuff. They want more social services, but they don't actually care about the colonialism that they are already benefiting on, and they're certainly not going to question that or bother to like threaten to undo any of it because that would actually threaten their empire. Anyway, back to the book. The quote indignation called attention to the rising difficulties of a popular strata of the Jewish community, but did not pay any attention to the interminable tragedy of the people under military occupation. A professor at the Jewish University of Jerusalem described the tragedy in a prestigious U.S. American journal. In a prestigious U.S. American journal. At least as far as the occupied Palestinian territories are concerned, Israel is an ethnocracy, and in the final analysis, a racial state. The colonization of the land expropriated by force from the Palestinians continues uninterrupted. Those who dare protest are, quote, treated harshly, sometimes imprisoned for long periods, sometimes killed in the course of the demonstrations. All this occurs in the context of a, quote, malevolent campaign to make life as miserable as possible for the Palestinians there, in the hope that they will go away. It is an ethnic cleansing, even if diluted over time. And this is in 2011 he's saying this, remember. We see here an ethnocracy so harsh as to be, quote, all too reminiscent of the dark precedents in the history of the last century. And yet, those indignados protesting the high cost of living they faced, but indifferent to the cruel ethnocracy imposed on the Palestinians, were celebrated by two illustrious Marxist authors as champions of a new society, based on, quote, our relation to the commons. How fucking ironic is that? At the beginning of this section here, I had never heard of these indignados, and I didn't understand why. And it's because I just wasn't paying attention to any kind of Israeli protest movement. Back then, because I just didn't know anything about Israel or Palestine, but certainly now and since, because I know that Israel is shitty and bad, and I would never care about what they're protesting for. It's most likely going to be able to rape Palestinians more, if recent history is any indication. Schibel says founding of the United States was an extension of imperialism. Yeah, that too. Quite literally counter-revolution from the existing situation that was going on with indigenous people being here and like being in control of the territory. So was 2011 the year of, quote, the revival of radical emancipatory politics all around the world, as Zizek put it, or of the revival of the ideal of a society based, quote, on our relation to the commons, as Negri and Hart put it? Or was it the year in which colonial and neocolonial misdeeds were greeted with silence or conniving, even in the traditional areas of the left? Completely erasing the fate of colonized peoples from their balance sheet, Zizek, Hart, and Negri reproduced the basic limitation of Western Marxism by diluting it even further. From this point of view, the success that Zizek especially has enjoyed in our own times brings to mind, rather than a revival, the last gasp of Western Marxism. The removal of the colonial question is an integral part of the theoretical and political platform of the Slovenian philosopher. Far from the wished-for and dreamed-of totally other, capitalism completely dominates the world. It makes no sense to distinguish the imperialist and colonialist powers from those countries that only a short time ago liberated themselves from colonial domination, and that still, through trial and error, seek to overcome backwardness and achieve full independence economically and build for themselves political institutions adequate to their socioeconomic conditions and to their geopolitical situation. Zizek is no less hostile than Arendt to the category of the Third World. Indeed, he is more radical in his opposition to it. His irony is cutting against those countries that, despite identifying with a revolutionary ideology and sometimes with Marxism, fly the banner of anti-imperialism. Today's predominant class struggle is no longer between, quote, the capitalists and proletariat in each country, but instead occurs internationally between states rather than social classes. In this way, the Marxian, quote, critique of capitalism itself is reduced to and deformed into a critique of imperialism, which loses sight of what is essential, and that is the capitalist relations of production. It almost sounds like this last paragraph he's describing why people should not worry about geopolitics and instead focus on some kind of like proletarian internationalist class. But let's see. His irony is cutting against those countries that, despite identifying with a revolutionary ideology, why would what countries are they talking about? I don't understand. I guess I'll read on this next paragraph and see if it clarifies any further. But once the terrain has been cleared of the categories of the third world, imperialism, anti-imperialism, and so forth, the only sensible distinction, as far as the present is concerned, would be that between, quote, authoritarian capitalism and that which is not authoritarian. Okay, so I guess this is describing how Zizek does away with the imperialism, anti-imperialism distinction, which is, again, a nonsensical way to, which is why I was so confused. Like, why would you try to do away with that? It's like probably the main contradiction. In the former category, the first place goes to China, but Vietnam and perhaps Cuba also can be placed there. After the latter's recent opening to the market and the private sector economy, which at least lend toward capitalism, in any case, the countries of, quote, Latin America, marked by a, quote, populist capitalism and inclined toward caudillismo and authoritarianism, also end up there. Oh yeah, at the caudillismo, I guess they have the caudillos, which were like plantations, I believe, right? So these would be like the comprador class of Latin Americans who work with the first world to impoverish their own countries. Sorry for hitting my desk, folks. Looking closely, this represents the distinction disdained by the Slovenian philosopher, that of the third world on the one side and the capitalist West with its persistent colonial tendencies on the other. Only now, this distinction is reintroduced to the exclusive glory of the liberal West, which becomes the model to which the third world countries must aspire. Okay, yeah. So that is the common move, basically. It's like, it's usually like more hacky than I guess what Zizek does. Like, people who get columns in like popular newspapers, popular magazines, whatever, popular websites, people actually who think that they're progressives, but they just hate every country that isn't a Western country. The stuff that they read, what people usually do is they will find any kind of socially regressive thing they can and say, look, this country isn't like a rainbow flag flying liberal democracy. Therefore, even if they have like better social returns from their government, even if they have like demonstrably more democracy, like objectively more democracy in their government than the US or the West does, if they're not neoliberal and if they're not opening up their markets, we're going to find something about the government that we can get liberal xenophobes who are like still racist in their interpretation of politics of the rest of the world. If we can get them to just find it icky, if we can get them to dislike those people, then we can call it whatever we want. We can call it authoritarianism. So that's like the really hacky and easy way to do it. By the way, if you want to go make a living as a media figure writing for liberal shit rags, go and do that. It's very easy to do. But so basically, I guess he's just explaining that Zizek does all these like philosophical somersaults and gets you to arrive at the same conclusion, basically, just with more wordiness. And again, it's the same kind of thing we're talking about, just like equating all of these things as authoritarian. They're all just bad. Everything except the West with its 800 military bases, that's not authoritarian. So now we're going back to The Soviets Expected It by Anna Louise Strong. And last time we were talking about the Birobidzhan area, which was that area cordoned off and given to the Jews by Stalin, I believe. I recall across the years one of the Birobidzhan leaders who went on the same train with me to Moscow. His energy and teasing laughter made him the life of the train. He frequently sat in the compartment with two Red Army commanders, joshing them about the quantities of edibles they consumed and declaring that he would have them arrested for upsetting the food balance of the country. Edibles don't mean the same thing for them. It's just funny now. Either way, it's very funny. Later, he told me that these two commanders gave him more delight than anything on the train. He told me of his own early life in the Ukraine amid constant pogroms. He repeated the discussions with the two Red Army commanders. They had been asking whether the Red Army gave adequate help to the Jewish settlers. Quote, "We hear they made you a road. Was it a good one? Do they help you properly with your harvest? How are relations developing between the Red Army and the new immigrants?" "Can you imagine what those questions mean to me, a Jew of Birobijan?" he asked. "No, you can never imagine it, for you cannot live my life. Those red commanders are the sons of the Cossacks who used to commit the pogroms, and now it is all gone like a dream. They want to know if they help us adequately. They are too young even to remember pogroms, but I remember. I am old enough." Later, I saw him reading Celine's Journey to the Edge of Night, that bitter summary of pessimism from Europe. For the first time, he seemed depressed. Quote, "I have been reading again. What horrors there are in the world," he said. "Even in our own land, there are hardships and injustices. But in the lands abroad, I tell you, our old Cheka and GPU were philanthropic societies compared to what we shall see in the lands abroad. Every meter of ground will be wet with tears and blood." Quote, "Our country was once the most oppressed in the world," he added, "and now it is the happiest. And the luckiest. Oh, incredibly the luckiest. Now, when the whole world slips further and further toward chaos and bitter struggle, we know that our children are safe. Oh, we shall have battles in plenty. Our border cities may suffer, but the heart of our land is safe. Our farms will expand, and our children go to school in peace through all the coming decades of great war." That was 6 years ago. He knew that the war was coming. Everyone in the Soviet Union knew. They built not only a total defense for the country as a whole, but a defense region by region, flexible but firmly knit together for the shocks that were coming to the world. This is kind of like what I imagine must be going on in China right now. Like I imagine like Chinese people must be at least viewing some of the shit that's going on in the rest of the world. Like if they're because again they don't have to. Like if you have a peaceful, flourishing, prosperous country, it's very easy to just be like their version of a liberal, just go along to get along and not have to pay attention to geopolitical stuff. But I imagine for the people that do, they have to be somewhat aware that shit's going very bad in the rest of the West, but they must feel this same level of like national self-satisfaction that they're doing the correct thing uh, while the rest of the world is like struggling to figure it out. Like it's got to be a good feeling. So chapter 6, the modernized Red Army. The growth of the Red Army in size, equipment, and efficiency fully kept pace with the rapid development of Soviet industry. The best of everything produced in the country went into the building of the Soviet military machine. Every Soviet citizen knew quite well that he was paying for the increasing strength of the Red Army by a lower standard in his own food, clothing, and shelter. But not once in the 20 years that I have commuted between New York and Moscow have I heard a Soviet citizen begrudge the cost. Bordered in all directions by actively or potentially hostile countries, they felt the first of their needs to be defense. An additional reason for the popularity of the Red Army is that it was never a separate institution divorced from civil life. It was always the central, specialized core of an armed people. This tradition began in the days of the Revolution. In dozens of factories in the Ukraine, which I first visited in the early 1920s, the shop committee proudly showed me collections of old rifles and shotguns kept in their, quote, museum near the director's office. Quote, "These were the rifles with which we workers defended our factory from its second story," they said. The Red Army had the advantage that it was born of revolution and unhampered by traditions of the past. If this carried with it the disadvantage of inexperience, that fault was quickly corrected in the wars of intervention in which Soviet Russia was invaded by armies of 14 foreign powers. The new Red Army generals were young and quick to learn from the military experience of the whole world. They were among the first in Europe to envisage the future forms of modern war. At a time when British and French military writers were still thinking in terms of the trench warfare of the 1914 to 17 and uh, German war effort was confined to theory by the Treaty of Versailles, military writers in the Red Army journals were predicting the form of World War II. Beginning in 1926 and thereafter, Soviet writers prophesied that future war would have the following three characteristics: great mobility at the beginning of the war, based on a powerful air force coordinated with highly mechanized ground troops. Second, a surprise attack that will rapidly overwhelm weak enemies with very small losses to the victor. And three, if two countries of comparatively equal strength are involved, and if the first surprise attack does not at once gain victory, the early stage of extreme mobility will pass into a relatively static war of position, though never so static as the War of 1914 to 17, and the war will be decided by relative economic resources, war reserves, and the morale of the people. Thus, the formula of the Second World War did not catch the Red Army unawares. Interesting. So yeah, I guess that's a good point. It's like because they were invaded by 14 different powers, they had no choice but to modernize their war efforts, their war understanding, their army itself, um, and we see where that led them. Knowledge is not enough to build an army. In those days, the Soviet Union did not possess the modern industry on which alone an army of mechanized, motorized troops can be based. From its earliest days, however, the Red Army was organized with ultimate mechanization in mind. It always had at its disposal whatever extent of modern equipment the development of the Soviet industries made possible. The foundations of the modern Red Army were laid in 1924 to 25 by Mikhail Frunze and elaborated after his death by Clemente Voroshilov, who is leading the northern armies of the Soviet Union today. A system of draft was introduced, by which every young man reported for military service during his 21st year. From among the 1.5 million who thus annually reported, the army selected in those days only 260,000 for the regular standing army and organized another 500,000 in territorial units who got part-time military training while continuing their civilian tasks. New military academies and special schools, quote, polished the fighting leaders of the Civil War and gave the Red Army for the first time a full staff of officers who were both loyal and trained. Quote, as a result of the work in 1924 to 28, reported Voroshilov later, quote, the Red Army got a modern structure, incorporating in its organization and training all the lessons of the World War. I guess they would call it the World War before that point. The primary military object of the first 5-year plan was to put the Red Army on wheels and wings and provide it with ultra-modern weapons. The size of the army was not at first increased. Those were the prehistoric days before Hitler's rise changed the power politics of the European continent. The armament race of Europe had not really begun. The Red Army, while not especially large, set mechanization as its goal. Even in 1928, when the plan began, the USSR had a fairly powerful air force, the nucleus of a future tank force, and had begun to construct a submarine fleet. Imagine having to do all those at once out of nowhere. Before the end of the plan, a few shrewd foreign observers noted the Red Army's rapid advance in modern weapons. A Polish military organ wrote in 1931 of the, quote, thorough way in which the Bolsheviks are carrying through the mechanization and motorization of the Red Army. The Japanese naval attaché Maeda wrote in 1932 about the great number of tanks and the fact that, quote, an enormous number of them are of the most modern type. The mechanization of the Red Army astonishes all the foreign attachés who are present at its parades. According to Pierre Cot, the French air minister who visited Moscow in 1933, the Soviet air arm was at least equal to the best in Europe in numbers, technical equipment, and above all, in the productive capacity of the aviation industry. Thus, by the end of 1932, which ended the first 5-year plan, the Soviet Union had reached the level of Western Europe in armaments, a fairly modest level judged by standards of later years. Yeah, they only kept going after that. That's crazy. Yeah, I mean, I can't tell you the number of times that I've had to defend either the USSR or just socialism or communism in general, and I've had to try out the old. Well, it was because of socialism or communism that they were able to turn Russia and these surrounding countries that it also united from this like feudal Tsarist oppressed backwater of agrarian lands into like this industrialized nation competing with America in the space race in less than a generation. And that's just like a quick shorthanded way to describe these kind of things that they were able to do, like, because you can't forget that they also had to fight wars while doing that. It's like the more you think about it, the more impressive it gets, and like people really just do not give the USSR enough credit. All right, let's see. The really spectacular increase in the Red Army and in its equipment began after Hitler's rise to power. The threat to the USSR that Nazi Germany implied was made plain enough by Hitler himself in his earliest books and in later statements in which he rattled the sword over the Soviet Ukraine. To meet the Hitler challenge, the Soviet military budget more than tripled in a single year, rising from 1.5 billion rubles in 1933 to 5.7 billion in 1934. The size of the army was increased at the same time from 562,000 to 900,000 men. The motorization of the army increased even more. The number of tanks and planes and military equipment generally has always been a military secret, the chief knowledge of which comes from guesses of foreign powers. The French air mission that visited the Soviet Union in 1936 put the production of airplanes at 5,000 annually and estimated that the USSR had at the time 5,000 first-line planes. The figure was supported by similar estimates of Swedish and German experts and by the fact that in the May Day parades of 1935, no less than 3,000 military airplanes were seen in the air above six big Soviet cities. In the first half of 1935, Major General Guderian, who now commands the tanks of the German Army of Invasion, estimated the number of tanks in the Red Army at 10,000 and placed the Red Army at the head of all armies in motor transport. Okay, so I guess they were just already assuming they had more than anybody else. The last report given to the world from Soviet sources was Voroshilov's report to the 18th Party Congress in March 1939. It was given chiefly in percentages and announced an increase of 130% in airplanes and 191% in tanks as compared with 1934. If these figures have any relation to the guesses made by the French and Germans, they would indicate well over 10,000 planes and more than 20,000 tanks at the time when the Second World War began, with Germany's invasion of Poland. It is to be assumed that tanks and planes were both rapidly increased thereafter, but the amount is unknown. First indications came from the Red Army's own admission of losses on August 24th after 9 weeks of war. The size of those figures startled the world. An army that could go on fighting, admitting the loss of 7,500 guns, 4,500 planes, and 5,000 tanks, was seen to have at least the second largest, if not the largest, supply of those weapons in the world. That's crazy. So yeah, they had lost so many after 9 weeks that they just startled the whole world. I'm like, wow, if you lost that many and you're still not done, how many do you actually have? Other official indications of the extent of the Red Army's mechanization come from Voroshilov's report in 1934 that 50% of the Red Army men were already, quote, technical specialists of various degrees, not including machine gunners. 5 years later, he reported that the, quote, motorization quotient, i.e., the mechanical horsepower per man, had increased from 2.6 HP in 1929 to 13 HP at the beginning of 1939, making the Red Army the most highly mechanized force in the world. He claimed that the, quote, bomb salvo of the Soviet Air Force, the number of bombs that can be dropped by all planes at once, had tripled in 5 years and had reached more than 6,000 tons. The artillery salvo of a Soviet Army Corps was placed at 7.136 tons, compared with 6.078 tons in the German Army. The firing rate was placed at 66.6 tons of shells per minute, compared with 48.7 in the German Army. Thus, the Red Army claimed not only more guns per Army Corps, but a more rapid rate of fire. Okay, so yeah, they're just like, this has always been like the trope, right, about Russia. Like, that's what all of the West says about Russia. They act like Russia has quantity and not quality. And that's why that's like literally the excuse the West always uses for either not being able to conquer Russia. And now we're including like both Germany and the rest of the West now that they're waging wars against Russia in very similar ways to Germany. Yeah, they just complain that there's too many goddamn Russians. They're like, oh, it's just too cold for us. There's too many Russians. They're willing to throw all their boys into a meat grinder and let us kill them. So therefore we lose. It's like, none of it makes sense on its face. It sounds like they're just better. It sounds like they're just doing it better. It sounds like the West is just coping. Probably the best indication to the layman of the Red Army's growth since the rise of Hitler is the fact that the money allotted to it in the Soviet budget grew nearly 40-fold. From 1.5 billion rubles in 1933, it grew to 57 billion in 1940. Since this growth is much larger than any estimate of increased planes, tanks, or other equipment, it indicates reserves of two kinds: reserves of supplies that have not yet appeared in battle, and basic investments in new war industry, which will begin production at some date not yet known. This throws some light on the Soviet estimate of the possible length of the war, in which they must keep in mind not only the strength of the German forces, but also Hitler's allies in many lands. The present war has already shown that the Red Army has not only large quantities of tanks, but several new kinds of tanks. Some of the Soviet tanks have shown themselves sturdy enough to overturn German tanks of equal size in head-on collision. The Soviet-invented amphibian tanks have driven through a tidal sea for 7 hours at a time. I didn't know about that. That's crazy. These feats are due not only to the quality of the machine, but to the fact that Red Army tank drivers have the skill born of many years of experience, beginning as tractor drivers on farms. Soviet airplane pilots also hold many world records, both in altitude and long distance flights. Their conquest of the Arctic and its difficult weather has accustomed them to the severest conditions. Americans will remember the Soviet pilots who twice made world records by flying from Moscow to America. These were individual exploits, but the development of Arctic aviation on which they were based was the work of large numbers of pilots and implies a whole air tradition. A final factor in the efficiency of the Red Army is the quality of its officers. They have always been drawn from the entire population on the basis not of birth or social distinction, but of proficiency in the art of war. British General Wavell, who saw the Red Army maneuvers in 1936, commented on the youth of the higher officers as a favorable factor. Pierre Cot mentioned their thorough training. They are young. They work hard. Their intellectual activity is remarkable. Everywhere in the Red Army we found laboratories, workshops, and technical equipment for independent work that aroused our admiration. There is nothing similar in our officers' training schools in Paris, Lyon, or Marseille. That's the French Pierre Cot. The four chief commanders of the Soviet army in its present war all rose from the common people. Marshal Timoshenko, defender of the Central Front, is the son of poor Bessarabarian peasants and himself a one-time farmhand. Marshal Voroshilov, defender of Leningrad and the North, is a former locomotive mechanic, son of a railway watchman and a charwoman. Marshal Budyeni, defender of the Southern Front, was born of poor parents in the Cossack region of the Don and rose to fame through the exploits of his, quote, First Red Cavalry Army. The commander of the Soviet Military Air Force, Lieutenant General Smuchkevich, a former longshoreman, is the son of a Lithuanian Jewish tailor. And that was also something people noted about the Soviet space race, is like the people who were going into space on the Soviet side were like sons and daughters of farmers. They were not like generational high class, like they're not like the waspy elites that were being sent into space by the US. And that was noticed. People at the time took notice of that too. The process by which these men rise was illustrated very simply by the way in which the young son of my housemaid became a first lieutenant. A gawky, half-educated boy of a poor family, he entered the Moscow ball-bearing works as an apprentice at the age of 16. He was swiftly drawn into the factory night school and soon chose as his, quote, social work to become a sort of amateur policeman, which meant that he took evening courses in law enforcement and helped police the big parades. He had no uniform, but he had a policeman's whistle, of which he was very proud. Once, when he came upon a drunken fight, I saw him blow his whistle to summon a regular uniformed policeman, whom he then assisted in taking the drunk to jail. Minor incidents of this type showed that young Tolley was developing a bent in two directions: mechanics and the handling of crowds. I was not surprised when, on entering the Red Army, he chose the Tank Corps, or when, after a year's service, he decided on a permanent military career. This decision, together with his abilities, enabled him to enter an army school which trained him at army expense to be a non-commissioned officer. After serving for a time in this capacity, he was sent to a higher school, from which he emerged as junior lieutenant. This alternation of periods of service with periods of education is the path by which all would-be officers rise. Even the higher officers return to the military academy at intervals to keep up on the latest developments of military science. And again, this is like old hat now for us on the Marxist left to talk about like the military as the example that Americans and Westerners can relate to for for how socialism could work in practice, for like how it actually functions if you just use the pool of government tax money to educate people rather than forcing them to pay for their own education, go into debt to do so, and then have like harried and precarious job prospects afterwards, or oftentimes lead to like the largest increase in homeless population that we've seen in recent decades. So, all right, I'll bookmark it here, but I will pick up on it again tomorrow. Thank you all again for listening as always, and hope you are enjoying following along with these books. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff here. I think it's really interesting hearing about this time of the Soviet, just life in the Soviet Union. I've never had this kind of an in-depth look at what it's like, and I don't know. I hope you guys are still enjoying the Gladio book. It's definitely salacious, if not surprising. it's cool just to hear the ins and outs and the actual workings of how this whole drug system goes. But yeah, crazy stuff. All right, guys. Thank you as always for